Hi ladies, this is Mrs. Blaufuss, and this is lesson 1.2 extension, and it's about coordinate geometry. So we're today going to talk about the midpoint property, and the midpoint property states that if x1 and y1 and point x2 and y2 are coordinates of the endpoints of a segment, then the coordinates of a midpoint are the sum of the x coordinates divided by 2 and the sum of the y coordinates divided by 2. So the midpoint, if you remember, is a point on a segment that divides the segment into two congruent pieces. So we're going to look at an example. So you see this example on your note sheet, and it says segment AB has endpoints -8, 5. Let's just call that point A, and 3, -6. Let's call that B. Find the coordinates of midpoint of the segment AB. So first let's plot those points. So let's plot -8, 5, that's A, and 3, -6, that's B. And we'll use our straight edge to connect those 2 points to form a line segment. We are looking for the midpoint of those 2 coordinates. So just by looking, it's going to be somewhere in here. I don't know exactly what it is, but I know that when I plot the midpoint, it should be in that range. So let's use the midpoint formula. If point A has endpoints -8, 5, I'm going to say that -8 is x1 and 3 is x2. Those are my 2 x coordinates. And my y coordinates are going to be 5 is y1 and -6 is y2. It doesn't matter which one you name as x1 or x2 or which one you name as y1 or y2. So now to find my midpoint, I'm going to use the midpoint formula. So my midpoint formula says that the midpoint is the sum of the 2 x's, which is -8 plus 3 divided by 2, and the sum of the 2 y's divided by 2, which is 5 plus a -6 divided by 2. Now 5 plus a -6 is just 5 minus 6. Okay, so we'll simplify. My midpoint is -8 plus 3, which is -5 over 2. And the y coordinate is 5 minus 6, which is -1 over 2. So if you were asked to find the coordinates of the midpoint, these would be your coordinates of the midpoint. Now, as you're graphing them, it's sometimes a little bit easier to put it into decimal form, so you can graph it just a little bit easier. When you give me answers, though, I want them in fraction form. Okay, so always give me answers in fraction form unless a decimal is given in the problem. Okay, so but just as to make it a little bit easier to graph, we're going to say our midpoint is -2.5 and -0.5. So let's go over here to our coordinate plane, and I'm going to go over 2.5 and down 1/2. And that is my midpoint. -5/2, -1/2. So that's how you can use the midpoint formula to find the midpoint of a segment on a coordinate plane. Now this is not on your note sheet, but we're just going to do a little bit of problem solving here. A lot of geometry is critical thinking. So let's say that we have this point A, and it's an endpoint of a segment, and its coordinates are 1, 3. So let's say we know one endpoint, and then we know this point here is the midpoint of the segment. And its coordinates are -2, -1. What is the coordinate of the other endpoint of the segment. So what are the coordinates of point B such that M is the midpoint of segment AB? Use the midpoint formula. Okay, so again, the midpoint formula tells us that the midpoint is x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. Now the midpoint is given in coordinates xy. So if we already have the midpoint, then what we need to do is solve for the other endpoint. Okay, so in this case, we already have the midpoint, and the midpoint is -2, -1. So I'm going to go ahead and just substitute these values in here. -2, -1. I also have values for one of the endpoints. So I'm going to go ahead and substitute those values into my formula. And I'll call it just x1 and y1. So I need to solve for x2 and y2. Okay, so I can focus on my x's first. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to focus on all of my x's first. And then I'll go back and focus on my y's. Okay, so I'm going to say 2, -2, my x coordinate is equal to 1 plus my second endpoint divided by 2. I have to solve for x sub 2, or my second x endpoint. And to do that, I need to isolate that variable. So I'm going to isolate x2, and I'm going to do that by multiplying both sides by 2. And I get -4. I'm going to do that in orange. I get -4 is equal to 1 plus x sub 2. And then I'm going to isolate x sub 2 by subtracting 1 from each side. So my answer is -5 equals x sub 2. Okay, so that tells me that somewhere where x is -5 is going to be my other endpoint. It's going to be right here. Now I need to find the y coordinate for that. So I'm going to do something similar, but I'm going to use all my y values. So my first y value, -1, right here, is equal to 3 plus y sub 2 divided by 2. And again, I'm going to isolate my variable. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. And I get -2 is equal to 3 plus y sub 2. And then I can subtract 3 from both sides to isolate my y sub 2. And I get -5 is equal to y sub 2. Okay, therefore, my coordinate for point B is -5, -5, where my x is -5 and my y is -5. Okay, so if you're given any two pieces, the midpoint and an endpoint, you can find the other endpoint. If you're given the two endpoints, you can find the midpoint using this formula. Okay, let's look at that last example on your worksheet. Pay attention to the point of origin. Okay, so just make sure that you are looking at your coordinate plane correctly and identifying the coordinates correctly based on where the origin is. I want you to pause this video and solve this one on your own, and you can unpause for the solution. Right, so the first thing I'm going to start with is I'm going to actually label all of these coordinates, A, B, C, and D. Okay, so again, this is my point of origin, so make sure you pay attention to the signs when you're labeling your X and your Y coordinates. Secondly, it says that I'm looking for the diagonal of this, so I'm going to go ahead and sketch in my diagonals. And then we're looking for the midpoints of those diagonals. So I'm going to use the midpoint formula, and you'll see the midpoint formula for segment BD, and I'll use the midpoint formula for segment CA. So in the first segment, segment BD, I identified point B as 1, -3, and that's what I'm using as x1, y1. And I identified D as -3, 3, and that's what I'm using as x2, y2. So when I plug it into my midpoint formula, I get an x value of -1 and a y value of 0. And you can see that I plotted it on my coordinate plane. And now let's look at the midpoint of segment AC. And when I use -3, -3 for A and 1, 3, C, and I plug it into the midpoint formula, I get a midpoint of -1, 0. So in a rectangle, this diagram shows a rectangle. In a rectangle, the two diagonals meet at the same midpoint. Okay, that means that these two segments are the same and these two segments are the same. So your homework in this lesson is related to midpoints and finding different points on coordinate geography. So please jot down any questions you have and then see me or ask those questions during our next class. Thank you.